shows Freddie Gray minutes after his initial arrest, the last time he was seen publicly and alive.
We report from Baltimore, where the governor of Maryland has declared a state of emergency, and the mayor of Baltimore has announced a week-long curfew beginning tomorrow night.
Severe injury to his spinal cord. Cell phone video they arrest shows police dragging him into a van.
The mystery that remains in this case, that 45 minutes that Freddie Gray spent in the back of a police transport van. What happened to the back of that van?
This was where police first called for medical help for 25-year-old Freddie Gray after he was arrested just a few days.
Overnight, residents taking to the streets for a second night, unhappy with the answers from authorities. The family's attorney says police.
So we are under the impression that when you see these uprisings, on television or, recounted in any kind of social media or on the news, that people are burning down, quote unquote, their own neighborhood. Right? This is a term that we have heard, we may have even used it in certain contexts. What we fail to understand is that segregation means that you live in a community that you do not own, right? This is a precondition from Jim Crow that's been mapped into the post-Jim Crow period. In most instances, when you look at Baltimore, when you look at areas like Ferguson, Missouri, when you look at what's going on, in South Central Los Angeles, going back to the 1960s through the 90s, other parts of the South and so forth, most times what you have are different merchants, landlords, other kinds of investors who have the lion's share of the property, the small businesses, the real estate in the community, and they are, again, squeezing these residents for maximum returns on their investment. So if you live in a white neighborhood that has great tree cover, that has paved streets, decent schools, if you make an investment in real estate in that neighborhood, you accumulate what's called equity. In black neighborhoods, because of the way that they have been chronically uninvested in, and because of the way in which people look to basically make their money in any way they can in terms of squeezing poor people, you have to understand that black communities are not allowed to accumulate equity to the same degree that white communities are. They're not given the same kinds of investment. Landlords don't put as much money into the properties. Business owners don't put as much money into the brick and mortar shops that they own. So this is what sets black folk up, because wherever black folk are allowed to live, there are structural forces that then devalue black life. So that when there's a moment of police brutality, when there's a moment of justice that's been, foreclosed on for black folk, they're making a statement, not just about a general sense of unrest, but there is actually a very clear sense of that particular shop owner has been gouging my family for years. This landlord has been running the neighborhood down. So you're talking about higher prices or fluid prices and lower quality. And you could pretty much map any category of daily needs into that box to say the food is higher price, low quality. The education that you could get, in terms of the access to electronics or other kinds of benefits in the system, you're paying more because you're paying taxes, but you're not getting the high quality education. So again, the cost and benefit is skewed. So all this to say that when folk are uprising in urban America, or even in parts of poor suburban America today, they're doing so as part of an outrage around the economic situation that they're, again, contained and boxed in and forced to experience.
Cameron's house is the only one they've ever owned. The American dream, instilled by family.
You bought your house first, and that's the way we went, saving our money to buy a house.
The Cameron's house is in Edmondson Village on the west side of Baltimore. The two-story brick row homes on the block were built in 1942, 1,200 square feet. The builder was the company founded by James Keelty. At about the same time, the company built similar houses in Rogers Forge in Baltimore County. Two-story brick row homes, 1,200 square feet. Chris DeGiorgio has raised his family here.
And it hasn't changed forever. It's right. It's been stable for the last 20, 30 years. Nothing's changed.
Two neighborhoods, almost identical houses, built by the same company at almost the same time. But today, there's a distinct difference in the value of the properties. In recent years, sales of houses here in Edmondson Village have averaged $84,969. Over the same time, Sales on this block in Rogers Forge have averaged $274,287, more than triple.
My name is Antero Pietala, and I'm the author of Not in My Neighborhood. Not in My Neighborhood is the story of segregation in Baltimore. And Baltimore was a laboratory of segregation because in 1910, the city enacted the first municipal law anywhere in the United States that segregated various races. So in Baltimore, what the city council did was you could not move to a block where your race was not in majorities. And so this was the first legislation of that sort. A couple of dozen other cities followed this measure. And then the next stage was restrictive covenants that barred certain ethnic groups, mostly blacks and Jews, from residing in a neighborhood. And then the following stage was redlining, in which the federal government enforced segregation measures to determine where people could live in various cities.
Redlining is a term that describes a practice whereby banks, mortgage companies, and the federal government work together to determine who got mortgages and who didn't. Really a practice beginning in the 1930s and staying in effect in some form or another, some have argued really until the present day. The term redlining refers to the physical maps that were used to map out neighborhood risk, and red is the color that was used to basically set aside or determine those most detrimental or riskiest neighborhoods. There were red areas that were given a D grade, yellow areas given a C grade, blue areas, which are probably the second best, at a B grade, and then green areas were given an A grade. They were considered the most pristine investment possible. And so we use the term today, redlining, to describe a process where African Americans are discriminated against because most black people, by and large, were by definition confined to those D areas on those maps.
The process that we used to acquire the properties was we identified specific areas of the city that were considered areas of opportunity. We wanted to acquire single-family homes in communities where our residents would have access to good schools, access to amenities such as transportation, good transportation and parks, as well as access to quality grocery stores and other shopping needs.
In Baltimore, education and housing changes have always been interconnected. Baltimore was, in 1954, when schools were desegregated, Baltimore was the only big city that segregated immediately and system-wide. And it is interesting that one of the first areas where desegregation happened was along Caton Avenue and Baltimore Street near Edmondson Village, where there was a high school, junior high school. And immediately after blacks started going to the junior high school, houses went up for sale. And so this is how the change of Edmondson Village then happened, is that in housing change, real estate speculators, they skipped blocks, and so the whites never knew where the next block would be, where black buyers residents would come. So that's how schools really contributed to the desegregation of neighborhoods.
Before I talk about the differences that I see in rich communities and poor communities when it comes to education, I want to talk about the similar qualities. What I notice about poor communities and rich communities, they want the best for their children. What I know about poor communities and rich communities, they will fight for their children. What I know about poor communities and rich communities, both of them want to advocate for their children. But what I know, the difference between the rich communities and poor communities, the poor communities don't have the vocabulary. The poor communities don't have the pedigrees. The poor communities don't have the degrees. The poor communities don't have the wherewithal to fight for the things that their children should get.
As we all know, redlining, it's been a history of redlining in the city of Baltimore going back decades. Our CEO, Janet Abrahams, and I believe that our residents deserve to live in areas of the city for which they choose, and by us acquiring these single-family homes in areas of opportunity where they have access to good schools and amenities and low crime rates, this will ultimately provide a positive environment for our families and also upward mobility for them.
So I believe there's an immense opportunity, especially in cities such as Baltimore City, where we have over, I think it's like 16,000 vacant units. There's an opportunity there for the local municipality agencies such as housing, the local permitting offices, things of that sort, to partner with the larger developers such as the NHP Foundation, as well as smaller developers. And there's a healthy population of small developers within the Baltimore, the local market, that can help participate and work towards realizing these efforts of making it more of a common practice without or throughout the city.
Tech played a huge role in this process because we believe with our developer partner NHP and our team that the ability to finance the Hollander Ridge project would not have been possible without the low-income tax credit program, because it allowed us to leverage these tax credits with other financing to be able to rehabilitate the 94 properties that we acquired, which allowed our residents to move into newly renovated homes.
The low-income housing tax credit was huge for this project. It made up about 27% of the total sources for the deal.
Single-family construction is very different than multifamily construction. In the multifamily construction environment, you're able to replicate processes, layouts, things of that sort. The property locations tend to be more densely populated, so they're easily accessible. Whereas on the single-family development type of project, the individual scope of work varies from unit to unit. So you essentially have to treat every house as its own isolated project.
So the benefit of this house that we're in now really is the fact that, number one, it's in a great school district. The finished basement is going to be an opportunity for kids to be able to go and play. There's a large backyard for them to do the same thing. There's a walking trail across the street, park that abuts this house, so they'll be able to go and experience nature, whether it be hiking or doing things that you just hope kids would do.
We are not teaching children at a very young age about financial literacy, about equity in homes, and about home ownership. I remember the neighborhood that I lived in when I lived in Bolton Hill. And one of my students, when I ran my school at Johns Hopkins, when I told him where I used to live and he lived on the other side, he said, "Man, Dr. Shields, we used to call that the white side. That was the great side. That's what he called it. That was the great side." Like what he said, I said, "Why'd you call it the great side?" He says, "Because, man, we would drive through there on our bikes and it was only 2 or 3 blocks over." And he was like, "Man, it was so great over there. We would actually imagine what our lives could be like." What our lives could be like. And that young man right now is a homeowner.
The difference that residents feel with a single-family home versus an apartment building is almost night and day. There's a different sense of ownership when you're capable of cutting your own grass, planting flowers, being able to have a playground in your backyard for the kids. It's different from being in an apartment building, which may have many of those amenities, but the ability to have your own plot to be able to do those things is a different feel. The impact on children, I think, is going to be the most notable. And the reason behind that is because you're going to give children the opportunity to live in diverse neighborhoods with low crime, access to community amenities that they otherwise probably would not have access to, the ability to go to good schools, the ability to see what life is like being in a single-family home, what that neighborhood looks like. Children in the next 10 to 15 years are really going to show the impact of Hollander Ridge and its effect on the community.